Welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for about an hour as we talk about COP27 renewable energy and specifically within the Asia Pacific. My name is Michael Ottaviano. I'm a partner with ERM and I lead our renewable energy efforts across the Asia Pacific. And for those of you who don't know, ERM is the world's leading sustainability consulting firm. Just a few house rules before we kick off today. We want this to be an interactive session. It's an hour of your time. Please engage as much as you like. You can post questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time, and we will be having a Q&A session at the end. We will endeavour to take as many of your questions as we can. The webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch this back again. It'll be published on ERM's YouTube channel. And we'll also send you a link with the presentation that you're about to see as well, so that you have that for your own reference. We've got hopefully live transcription happening at the moment in English. That means there's some bot translating my Australian into English for you all. You just need to click the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and say show subtitle. And again, after this, we're always keen to take any questions, thoughts or feedback. So feel free to complete a survey that will come up at the end. You'll just need to, it'll be a QR code. You'll just need to hover your phone over that and click through. So again, welcome. Appreciate your time today. We're coming to the end of what has been what it feels like a very dynamic and challenging 12 months. If you reflect on the last 12 months in particular, we've had an enormous amount of economic uncertainty, supply chain disruptions. We've had the ongoing impacts of COVID, and it's all been punctuated by heat waves, floods and storms. And today what we'll try and do is focus on one of those more recent events, the COP27 in particular, and in particular some of the insights from the offshore wind industry. We'll present a summary of a report that we presented at COP27, and then we'll move into a panel discussion where we will talk specifically around opportunities and challenges for renewables and offshore wind throughout APAC, and as I mentioned, and with the audience Q&A. Before we throw to our presenter, I just thought it would be worth doing a couple of things. One is getting you to do some work briefly by answering a couple of questions. Pretty easy questions, so don't fear that. But there's two questions that will appear on your screen now. The first here, which sector does your organisation represent? If you could click the relevant button. And then once you've done that, you'll just need to scroll down on your screen. And then we're keen on your specific views around whether the COP27 is likely to help accelerate the implementation of renewable energy and specifically offshore wind energy. And you've got 4 choices there to pick from as well. So we'll give you a few moments just to complete those 2 questions. While you do that, I might just run through some of the highlights as I saw them for 2022, particularly within our sector and in our region. We saw the Indian government announce a 500,000 megawatt, a 500 gigawatt 2030 renewable energy target. Indonesia signing a $20 billion clean energy deal with G7 nations. South Korea taking arguably a global leadership position in floating offshore wind with the Shell and Hexacon 1,300 megawatt floating wind project, which would be the largest in the world. And incredibly, they'll achieve 1.3 gigawatts with just a few more than 80 turbines, given they'll be using 15 megawatt Vestas offshore wind turbines for that project. Japan announced the outcome of its round 1 offshore wind results and preparations for round 2. And whilst down under in Australia, we spent a lot of the year underwater, we do also have a new climate-friendly government about to release its first offshore wind licenses. And globally, obviously, at the same time, Britain managed to have 3 prime ministers and 2 monarchs. The US got the Inflation Reduction Act, and we've seen many other events as well impact the energy scene. So the results of poll 1, question 1, which sector does your organisation represent? Perhaps not surprisingly, we've got a heavy representation from the renewable energy sector and the energy sector more generally, with oil and gas. Often hard to distinguish between the two as the energy transition takes hold. And if I can scroll down myself, I'll tell you that the outcome of question 2 is, and just remind you, the question there was, do we think COP27's help with the implementation of renewable energy? And I can tell you that half the people think that it has been somewhat successful. With the next one, interesting enough, behind that being, don't know too much information to navigate, and I feel your pain. There is an overwhelming amount of information coming out of COP27, and hopefully today's seminar, we can help you navigate some of that information. So with that behind us, let us move on now to the presentation for today. We're very fortunate to have one of ERM's partners from our European business, specifically coming to us from Milan. Brianne Gelatli is a partner in our Milan office. She's got over 15 years of experience in offshore and onshore wind across Europe, North America and Asia, and right across manufacturing, resource assessment, LCOE calculations, project management, sales and contract negotiations. Really a well-rounded experience. And Brianne was part of our delegation, part of ERM's delegation to COP27, where we released really a state of the nation report on offshore wind, and she's very kindly today agreed to take us through the highlights. So over to you, Brianne.
Great, thank you very much, Mike. And yeah, thank you for everybody that has taken their time to listen to this presentation. I did have the fortune of joining the ERM delegation in Sharm el-Sheikh a few weeks ago, and this report that I'm about to present was very much a key discussion material with a lot of the people that I talked to and the panels that I joined and the interviews that we had as a company. So I'll add a few thoughts from the discussions at COP as well to the slides. So if you could please start with the first slide. So I think carrying on from the full discussion of things that came out of COP27, one, and this is focused on offshore wind, as you know, so one that struck me as being quite a positive announcement was that 9 new countries have joined the Global Offshore Wind Alliance. And this is an important alliance because it is an alliance that brings together government, industry, NGOs, and other stakeholders to the offshore wind arena to accelerate the deployment of offshore wind. It says something that more and more companies and countries are joining. So this was one of the bigger announcements at COP from my perspective. There was quite a few supply chain panels and other industry panels. So there's links for those as well if you want to continue your knowledge of some of the discussions and key topics at COP. So just my 2 cents on the poll question. Now we can get into the presentation. If you can move to the next slide, please. Great. Okay, so the contents of this presentation are very much reflected in the same way that we do our market intelligence reports. So I'll give you a status of the market, share some information on market activity, and then go into some policy and leasing changes. to kind of pull out some of the main points from the report and also that were discussed at COP. I think the biggest one is just there's a huge portfolio of projects across new and existing offshore wind markets. Now we're reaching 1.190 gigawatts. The other important message, I think, is just with the increased technical maturity, floating foundations are becoming more economic, and we're seeing a huge pipeline for floating projects as well over the next few years. And this is quite interesting in APAC regions, such as Japan, for example, where you have very deep water, and it is a technology that's going to really open up the offshore wind market. And then perhaps not as positive of a message, but still, I think an important one, and that was also reflected in some other net zero conversations, were just that with we looked at all of the countries with 2030 targets. 15 have stated government targets, and based on our forecasting tool, we have assessed that only 3 of those 15 are actually on track to meet those ambitions. So this is something that came through in a lot of different areas in COP. Just, it's great the government has policies, but we need to make sure there's a healthy supply chain and policies in place to ensure that those targets can actually be realized by industry, because there's no shortage of interest from industry. So I would like you to please move to the next slide. Great. Okay, so this is just a snippet from our database. It's called the GRIP database. I'll reference it a few times in this presentation. It's basically where we track all of the offshore wind projects globally. So this is broken down, the total, into projects that are either in development. So that's pretty much anything before FID. And then secured is somewhere between FID and when they're operational. And then operational is, I guess, self-explanatory, that they're actually producing electricity. So you can also see the countries that are contributing the most to that in actual operational wind farms, as well as targets. So what the government is saying. So this is an important consideration, is how they will actually meet what they're aspiring to do. All right, next slide, please. Good. Okay, and then this is just a breakdown by regions. So I think when you look at the APAC region, there's quite a lot of interest there. There's a huge development pipeline, and there's also quite a few projects that are underway. So EMEA is still the leader, but maybe in a couple COPs, this balance will change. Maybe it will look more equal, we're thinking, because of the Americas also have, with the Inflation Reduction Act, they have definitely created a policy that's going to help them achieve some of their more aggressive offshore wind targets as well. So this graph may look very different over the next few years. All right, next slide, please. Great. I alluded to this at the beginning. We also track the fixed foundation and the floating foundation. And this is important, I think, because fixed foundations, the ones that we started with, right? That was more, the technology was more similar to what we've done in other offshore industries. So it was the right way to start with the fixed foundations. And so I think it's important to also see what's happening with floating. We don't have a lot of projects in floating, but we've got a lot of development interest. Some key countries that have interests in floating in the next kind of imminent few years: France, Italy, Norway, Spain, the US, and the UK. We have seen demonstration projects. Japan has done quite a lot in this area. Maybe you've also seen some of the work done with in Scotland. So this is a technology that's going to open a huge number of projects that otherwise weren't feasible from a technological perspective, and also from a cost perspective, because the technology wasn't quite there yet. So this is a very exciting part of offshore wind, I think, that's going to help achieving some of those targets. Next slide, please. Great. And then this is breaking down where the floating projects are. So still not the same as the fixed foundations, but you can see that there's definitely geographies that will benefit from having this technology. And it's global. It's not just Europe. There's countries all across the world. So things like this alliance are going to be important in sharing knowledge and also figuring out supply chain synergies between countries as well. Next slide, please. So this is a auction timeline. One of the things that we do is we keep track of where the next auctions are going to be, because this is also important when we're trying to forecast how much offshore wind development actually going to turn into operational wind farms. So I think this is quite a good message too, that this slide shows that you can see a lot of different flags on here, and there's a good timeline. So different offshore wind developers are looking globally at projects, and we update this regularly. So as we move more into the future, I suspect we will see more auctions added to this as well. All right, next slide, please. So I think the key message on this slide, what we're trying to do here is to track commissioning activity. So the message here is about supply chain, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call have heard, or maybe you even work in the offshore wind supply chain. And so it's an area that really needs to be considered when we're looking at these very ambitious government targets. The supply chain needs to grow, the existing supply chain. Risks need to be spread across the whole value chain of offshore wind. So it's not just one part of the supply chain that's holding most of the risk. And it needs to be economically attractive, because we need other companies to come in if we're going to make this accelerated growth possible. Another big message that came out, and if you listen to the supply chain panel that I had added the link to, you'll see that there was a lot of discussion on the time frame that governments take to build, to go through the consenting process. They could take 10 years from when a project starts to when it's actually operational. So these things, government needs to change that. It's hard to, as the supply chain, to have these timeframes when you have things like inflation that happen, and all of a sudden your contracts are in a totally different world when you're actually building projects than when you started. So there was a very big call to action for governments to streamline things and to also support the full supply chain to make sure that it's an attractive industry for existing and for new entrants, if we're going to meet these really, really aggressive commissioning forecasts that we're seeing. All right, next slide, please. So I think what we also tried to do in this report was to show some changes year over year, right? This isn't what we typically report on, but we did a particular analysis on this. And so I think the good news is, just like some of the other slides have been alluding to, just this huge interest in offshore wind. So we've seen an increase of 112% globally. So just to draw out a few examples on that, Brazil is committed to climate change neutrality by 2050 and is responsible for 20% of the new offshore wind projects announced over the last year, with over 160 gigawatts under environmental review. Under the Biden administration, the US has aligned policies such as the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides long-term security to accelerate offshore wind. And then, already a leader in the offshore wind space, the UK has further increased its target from 40 gigawatts to 50 gigawatts by 2030, as the levelized cost of energy falls, making offshore wind even more cost competitive. Australia expects their first offshore wind project to be in operation by 2028, with targets of 4 gigawatts by 2035 and 9 gigawatts by 2040. In addition to their existing net zero ambition, European nations have accelerated growth plans in response to rising energy security concerns. Reduced cost of floating offshore wind has spurred over 20 gigawatts of new projects announced across Italy, France, Norway, Spain, and the UK. Germany's Easter package, aimed at the build out of renewables and grid connections, will increase the offshore wind target to 30 gigawatts by 2030. Denmark raised its 2030 offshore wind target by 45% to 12.9 gigawatts. the Irish government has increased the target for offshore wind capacity from 5 gigawatts to 7 gigawatts by 2030. And the Netherlands have also ramped up plans by doubling offshore wind targets. So there's a lot of really positive things happening in the offshore wind industry. A lot of governments, different approaches to doing things, but they're definitely trying to attract investment and growth in the industry. Next slide, please. So there's also the flip side of this, and I mentioned this in the executive summary, that we have been tracking these ambitions of governments for 2030, just as an example of how successful governments are at setting policies that will meet their wind ambitions. And this is not such a nice picture, because we do not expect that more than 3 countries will meet these targets unless things significantly change. We need to, I don't think it's the industry. There's a lot of interest there, but it needs to be attractive for countries to build out in such a large way. And there also needs to be coordination, because as you know, if you work in the supply chain, it doesn't make sense that every country has their own full supply chain for offshore wind. It needs to also be coordinated. All right, next slide, please. So some of the challenges, the lengthy processing. We talked about this with how long it can take to 10 years before you can get an operational project. Planning and consenting approval can take 4 years to 5 years on average. So this is clearly an area that can be reduced. Yeah, supply chain, I think that was one that came out quite a few times at COP, and also just in my position, we do see a lot of supply chain gaps and frustration. Inflation of raw materials, that's affected a lot of industries, but of course, offshore wind, with these long timelines, it's very difficult to price when you have these huge inflation impacts. And then grid reinforcements, because there's good ideas, there's talks about energy islands, but we can't do any of these projects if the grid isn't set up to take on this electricity that is coming. So next slide, please. Great. So I think then some of the actions that we can take on, permitting processes, governments can work on that. Investment in the supply chain is a huge one. Also, workforce development shouldn't be underestimated. There's a lot of young people that are very passionate about net zero, and getting them into the right educational stream so they can take on this increased workload, this bigger industry, is going to be really important. There's also making sure that there's sustainable profit margins, and the timing of the grid to make sure that planning is done in unison and stakeholders are aligned from the start of offshore wind activities. Then some other ideas on how to accelerate it, I think, with new markets, is just learning from some of these challenges from Europe, and regional cooperation is key to building out these offshore wind ambitions in the most cost-effective way. All right, next slide, please. Great, and then this is just, if you're interested in looking more of the data, because I know this report was full of graphs and numbers, you want to look at some of it as related to your own project or your own geography, there's a link there. You can access a free trial as thanks for joining our presentation. And that's all. So I will hand back over to Mike. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Brian. Really appreciate you taking the time to give us that overview of some of the data that we collect here at ERM and at RCG, and you know, some of those insights are astounding. I mean, I think the rapid interest and rise in interest in offshore wind across Asia in the last 2-3 years has been extraordinary, and the ambition for many of those countries globally, but also across across the region is also very large. So if we could move forward, thanks to the next slide, because just before we jump to the panel, we are going to get you to answer one more question, which is a little, somewhat informed by Brianne's presentation. The question here is, which country, sorry, that's my dog. We'll try again. Which country, apart from China, will have the most operating offshore wind by 2030? Brianne, could you jump on and take that question while I just go and attend to my dog? My apologies.
Of course, of course. So which country, apart from China, will have the most operating offshore wind by 2030? And you have a single choice for this one.
How are we going?
We're waiting for answers to come in.
Fantastic, thank you. So and perhaps we explain why we're excluding China from this question, or should I do that?
Go for it.
No, okay. So the reason we've asked to ignore China for the purpose of this question is simply because China is going to be such a dominant force, clearly in offshore wind. Potentially, I mean, I think Brianne had a pipeline there showing of a terawatt by 2050 of offshore and onshore. So we put that to one side because it's really another APAC in itself. And keen to see your answers now around where we think which country may take a leadership position. And so the results are up now, and it's very interesting. So Australia comes through as with nearly a quarter of the votes, very closely followed there by Taiwan with 19% and Japan with 15%. So really interesting. Taiwan obviously has a bit of a head start, I would say, amongst those countries. Korea's there at 5%. Japan rapidly moving into, as we know, into its round two as well. And Australia really just about to start the journey, but clearly people see a lot of potential there for Australia. And there's a few other countries there as well mentioned that I'm sure will have a big role to play. So let's move on from the polling question and move into the final part, and really the more interactive part of today's session. As I mentioned at the start, we're very, very fortunate to have a range of ERM experts from around the region. And what I'll ask them to do now as I introduce them is to come on camera, and I'll start with Laura Evertson, who's a director in our Taiwan office in Taipei. Laura has come into the ERM family from an acquisition we made, a bit like Brianne, about 12, 18 months ago, of the Renewables Consulting Group, which really gives us a very well-rounded technical advisory capability alongside our traditional environmental and social capability. Laura spent most of her career in offshore wind. She leads large teams around project delivery from conception through to operation. So thanks for joining us, Laura. Jovi, if you could also come on now. Jovi is also in our Taiwanese team, but from our heritage ERM business, and has been advising clients on really a wide range of sustainability issues over the past 15 or more years. He has a particular focus on marine infrastructure and offshore wind farms as well. So thanks for joining us, Jovi. And then finally, David, if you could come on as well. David is based in Vietnam and one of our key players in our energy transition team there in Southeast Asia. David's a well-qualified PhD in marine science, done a lot of work over 25 years in marine environmental impact studies, has been doing a lot of offshore wind work in Vietnam as well as elsewhere, and is currently delivering a number of international bankable approvals for renewable projects in Vietnam. And of course, Brianne's still with us as well. So thank you all for joining us. I've got a number of questions, some easier than others for our panelists today. And as I say, I'm happy to take Q&A from the audience as well. So, but I'll start, I think, Laura, I'll start with you, and I'll throw this question to everyone, but Laura, if you could tackle it first, and particularly from a, I guess, a technical point of view, and also from a Taiwanese point of view, and then, you know, as general as you'd like to go. But we heard Brianne mention some of the challenges and the opportunities in offshore wind in her presentation. Just reflecting on that, how do you see the challenges and opportunities for renewables and offshore wind in particular in the work that you're currently doing in Taiwan and elsewhere?
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. It's really good to join you today. So yeah, I think, you know, it's really interesting because, you know, Taiwan at the moment is seen as leading in the APAC region. We saw obviously on that poll that some people think that Australia are going to inch ahead. And, you know, I can't blame people for thinking that, because there are quite a few challenges at the moment in Taiwan. So, you know, I think we've seen Taiwan develop through its different auction rounds. So round one was very kind of close to shore, near shore projects, smaller in size, test case projects. Round two is obviously getting bigger, getting further offshore. And the government then started to really introduce more stringent targets around localization. What we're seeing now as we're into the first phase of the round three projects is actually that those localization targets are getting stricter. So these, you know, this comes as quite a shock to many of the Western developers that are looking to enter into Taiwan. You know, they're not used to seeing some of these requirements. And there's also, it's not just a nice to have in Taiwan. You know, these are a prerequisite to the auction round. So you have to actually meet all these local content requirements for all the various components. And it's also not just components, I should say, it's also services as well, and also vessels and vessel crews. So very, very different to what we're seeing in the Western world. In round three as well, we're also seeing a 500 megawatt cap per developer, and that has put off some of the major developers in Taiwan. So Ørsted at the last minute, we understand, decided not to bid into the round three phase one auctions. And, you know, that was quite a shock because they're very active here and they also do a lot with local community. And then we also have the issue around price. So the bid price is fixed and it's set to decrease with every round. And, you know, it's difficult. We're in very different circumstances now globally. And trying to make these projects work, you know, is very difficult with increasing prices and the energy security crisis. CPPAs are also an issue in Taiwan. There's lots of challenge around those in trying to, you know, find the suitable off-takers. You know, the large one, the semiconductor TSMC, has been snapped up by Ørsted. And so you find developers now having to shop around for lots of smaller CPPAs, which again, you know, increases risk and it becomes harder to make these projects bankable. But having said all of that, in terms of opportunities, you know, there are opportunities there. There's a lot of sites available in Taiwan. The government have issued a sensitivity map, which is great because you can see that there are areas that are still there for the taking. And the targets are high. You know, government has set very high targets for 40 to 55 megawatts of offshore wind by 2050. Floating offshore wind is just starting to be developed. You know, we're waiting on a fit price for that, but demonstration rounds now have been announced. And some of the rules are starting to be relaxed. So, you know, it is going in the right direction, but I think there are still a few challenges to be worked through.
Right, thanks, Laura. And I think some of those challenges are common across APAC. We're seeing concerns in Japan around sizes of potential license areas as well. Jyoti, what, you know, again, maybe with a focus on Taiwan, but more broadly, because I know you do work across the region. Anything in particular around the environmental and social aspects, perhaps, to add to what Laura's just said then?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks, Laura. So maybe let me power up on what Laura said about Taiwan and also a bit about South Korea as well. So I think actually for both places, the government are generally supportive of renewable energy development, in particular offshore wind, because both places have constraint on land supply, and you know the public, they don't like nuclear power projects. For Taiwan, you know, Laura mentioned, right, offshore wind play an important role on its net zero roadmap. for Korea, there are opportunities for the key supply chain players to not just supply to the local market, but to the regional market, which can be kind of like a collaboration later on. So I think that, there obviously, COP27 will further accelerate this development in the two areas, and there are lots of opportunities. So, I mean, in terms of the challenges, speaking from my expertise of environmental and social issues, I think, generally, the environmental and social impacts brought by the offshore wind development will require attention. I mean, for example, impacts to the biodiversity, marine mammal, seabirds, fishery livelihood. I mean, in both Korea and Taiwan, we see opposition from green groups, fishermen, and local community on offshore wind project due to the potential negative impacts. But I mean, in addition to managing environmental and social risk, these stakeholders are now looking for more. I mean, they're asking for potential benefits or opportunities created to them from the offshore wind project. For example, I mean, simply speaking, whether the wind farm could allow fishermen to operate, during its operation. So whether the wind farm can be designed to provide shelters that can help to enhance the fishery community, the fishery resources in the long term. So whether the wind farm can provide, potential marine enhancement, and if the developers are doing anything at all to help conservation and community development. So, I mean, in order to gain stakeholders' support and reduce risk to offshore wind projects, simply reducing impacts, will no longer be adequate. We need to consider, providing positive impacts to the stakeholders, to the community, to the environment through the project which are accepted by the stakeholders. I mean, it is challenging, but if you consider this early and do it properly, I think, you'll be able to get your social license to operate, and it's an opportunity, right, to ensure that no one is left behind while we try to build a better low carbon future for the community and for the people.
Thanks, JV. It's fascinating, isn't it? It's no longer just around ticking a box, ensuring compliance. It really is around co-benefits and winning social license through early on in the development to ensure successful delivery. David, I'll come up to, let's move across to Vietnam and to get your take on the world. Are you seeing a different dynamic in Vietnam at the moment, or is it some of the same opportunities and challenges in deployment of projects?
Yeah, look, I think pretty much the same, Mike. We certainly share some of the same challenges that those guys do. The opportunities in Vietnam, particularly for offshore wind, are huge. And on the eastern seaboard there, from South Korea, Taiwan, all the way down to Vietnam. I was presenting at a GWIC conference only earlier in the week, and they showed a really interesting map of where the shallow areas are and where the wind is, and this particular region is a hotspot for that. And obviously in Vietnam as well, we have a lot of sun here too. So look, I think in terms of the physical environment, this particular area is of interest, particularly from Europe and abroad. We have a lot of funding coming in from Korea and Japan as well, but also a lot of the big offshore players and renewable players are coming in from Europe. And we're seeing some of the old oil and gas and even coal-fired thermal power developers showing some interest in renewables as well. So there's definitely plenty of prospects. In Vietnam, we've been developing wind in the nearshore and offshore areas for quite some time. And in fact, we have quite a big renewable portfolio in solar, hydro, and also in wind. And there's already a strong investment in that as well. But the challenges that we face, and I think the polling is really interesting as well, Mike, because when you see Australia leading, you can see, but perhaps that's more got to do with policy readiness, about them being able to develop mechanisms to accommodate this shift and this transition. In Vietnam and maybe in Indonesia as well, you'll probably find that the policies and the mechanisms are slow moving, very difficult to be able to transition from an opportunity into an actual operation. In Vietnam, we have a power development plan, PDP8. I'm sure a lot of people have heard that in the region. We're still waiting for that, for the Vietnamese government to publish that. And we're hearing also huge delays across the region, not just in Vietnam, but in Indonesia, in Taiwan, and in South Korea, in the supply chain. We need materials, and we need to develop blades and turbines to be able to accommodate that as well. And it's just not available. So there are some key challenges that we're facing at the moment. But a very exciting time here in Southeast Asia and North Asia as well.
Thanks, David. Yeah, it is interesting. The difference in policies, obviously, across the region will create different challenges and opportunities in different countries. I think in Australia, after a long time of inaction, we're seeing action, and that's exciting, and possibly informing some of the results. I think also we're at the start of that offshore wind journey as well. So it's perhaps there's a little optimism bias at the start of the journey before the hard work really starts. But certainly we're seeing a huge amount of interest down here from international players globally coming into the market. Brianne, maybe just finally, just to finish that kind of point, I know you're operating outside of Asia, but with the European lens, is there anything that you would add around opportunities and challenges that maybe European countries have seen in the past that could be applied into the Asian market?
Well, I think what's exciting right now in Europe is that offshore wind in particular is cost competitive with thermal. So it's totally changing the dynamic. And now we're starting to talk about green hydrogen, which before didn't really have the same business case. So I think that's a big opportunity, which does have implications for the APAC region too, if we're starting to move green hydrogen, for example. I think the challenges, I kind of alluded to them in the presentation too, is around supply chain and better collaboration. Europe has the benefit of having a lot of countries and populations very densely packed. There's a super grid project which has the potential of connecting opportunities to be realized.
That's great. And I want to come back to collaboration in a moment as well between industry and maybe government. I'm going to ask you some really quick answers to this question. So maybe just a couple of minutes each or quicker if you can. This year has been really bookended by an awful humanitarian crisis in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine at the start of the year, and now we're just coming out of COP27 at the end of the year. Time to reflect on that, the energy crisis as it is in Europe, and whether and what, maybe, and let's assume that it has an impact. What sort of impact has that had in Asia? What challenges and or opportunities has it created specifically in Asia as a result of that energy crisis? And Laura, maybe I'll come back to you at the end of this one. I want to get maybe Brianne, just because you were just talking and you're in Europe, tell us where we're at right now with that and what opportunities that you see it might create for Asian countries in the renewable space.
Sure. Yeah, I think so first, some of what I've even seen are APAC industry investing in European projects as a developer, as an owner. I think that's good because there's probably some knowledge transfer that's going back and forth, and it's also supporting some of the acceleration of these European projects. The other area is supply chain, because as we talked about before, with the challenges of the supply chain, if Europe is trying to ramp up really quickly on energy, then they might need to leverage some of the supply chain in the APAC region where possible. So I think those two areas are potential changing dynamics between across APACs in response to the energy crisis.
Great. And David, I know you're dealing with a dodgy connection at the moment, so I'm not sure if you're back online or not. You are, I can see you, great. I'll throw to you, in particular around maybe around supply chain, if you were seeing something similar there on the ground in Vietnam, and also around LNG pricing and what impact that the energy crisis in Europe might have locally.
Yeah, it's certainly having impact on the supply chain. You know, you need a lot of energy to be able to construct and develop turbines. I mean, we're also seeing that with hydrogen as well. So, you know, with hydrogen developments, the price of LNG has gone up. Blue hydrogen is sort of less attractive. Green hydrogen is sort of a more viable prospect. So I actually think that the price of LNG, it may be having, in fact, a positive effect on renewable development. Certainly, it's probably going to delay those countries that are fossil fuel heavy, particularly around coal. Maybe they're going to rely on coal more, but across, particularly around Southeast Asia, LNG is the transition fuel. It is the fuel that we're supposed to be using, while we're waiting for renewables to become big enough for us to rely on it. So it's happening. It's a double-edged sword, if you like, Mike. There's two things happening there. There's probably going to be delay in the transformation of coal, or transitioning out of coal. And also there's a positive in that people are starting to rely on renewable developments more. Yeah,
it's interesting that cost impact, having potentially those two competing results, maybe coal sticking around for longer, gas being less competitive and therefore maybe spurring more renewables. I think the other aspect, hopefully, is that we recognise the energy security aspects of renewables as well. So it's not just the environmental and the climate impacts, it's the fact that this is an opportunity for Asia to become less dependent on fossil fuel imports as well. I do want to start taking some questions from the audience, and I'm going to pick out one here and throw it to you, Laura, which is specifically around how replicable the offshore project development model that's been used in Europe and the UK is in APAC. Is it a cookie cutter approach that we can cut and paste, or is it more complicated than that? So Laura, if you could talk to that, and then Jovi, I'd be keen to get your thoughts on collaboration between markets and governments, in particular in some of the dynamics you're seeing in project financing with some of the sovereign wealth funds. So Laura, perhaps you first on the replication of the European model, and then we'll throw to Jovi after that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's a really, really valid question, and it's actually a project that I'm working on with David at the moment in Vietnam, where we're advising a number of government bodies around, what development processes, what systems for permitting should actually look like. And I think in many ways it can be mirrored from Europe, but there are obviously differences that we see in APAC. So, obviously we have to take into consideration the different conditions that we're working in APAC. The design of turbines has to take into consideration things like earthquakes and typhoons, different ground conditions. And, we look a lot at the different models that we have in Europe to see which ones are best suited for transferring to APAC. And, the main thing that we look at is trying to shorten the development timeline as much as possible, because a lot of the countries in the APAC region here are at the very start of their journey, but there's huge potential for offshore wind, and so they need to act quickly. Like you say, you've got coal coming offline, for example, in Australia. You've got a tight timeline, to around 2028. You need to have some of these projects in the water and up and running. But it's not to say that necessarily a government-led permitting system, for example, would work in all the countries in APAC. Some governments might not be able to actually fund those, to do a centralized survey approach. So you do need to try to make sure that it fits with what is available and what can be actually achievable in each region. But I think there is a real focus on trying to do it quickly but efficiently.
Great, thanks, Laura. Jovi, collaboration opportunities and how much interest are we seeing from governments and sovereign wealth funds in this sector in Asia?
Yep. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Laura. So, I mean, we are seeing a lot of interest from finance institute on investment of offshore wind project and all kinds of renewable project. And investment is always a practical way of collaboration, right? Nowadays, we see many finance institutes are directing their outbound investment towards this type of green renewable projects. For example, banks from Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, they are investing in renewable projects in Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, etc. So, I mean, it is important for the finance institutes and for the developers to ensure that their projects are bankable. So many of these finance institutes, they are actually following Equator Principle, EP, on the investment, or they have similar in-house policy following, similar standard. And then, to abide by EP, right, projects need to look at risk related to not just technical, commercial, but human right, physical climate change risk, biodiversity, involuntary resettlement, labor working conditions, etc., according to some international standards such as IFC Performance Standard and World Bank Group Environmental and Health and Safety Guidelines. So, I mean, come to your point, developers who expand to Asia, for example, coming from Europe, they may not be familiar with these standards because their development could mostly in designated countries before. I mean, such as what I said, right, Europe, the States. So, I mean, it is therefore, very important for them to consider this standard, IFCPS, World Bank Group standard, Equator Principle early in the projects to ensure that their project will remain bankable after they got all this consent to construct and operate.
Is there a part of the, is it, when's the right time to engage, Jovi? If you're a developer with a project in Asia, can you be thinking about these things too early?
I think you need to think about that early. I mean, simply saying because many of the projects will undertake environmental impact assessment, right? So as part of the assessment, there are huge investment in terms of all the baseline studies that you have to do. So you would like to look at your study design at a very early stage to ensure that it is not just complying with the local regulations, but also to can comply with these international standards so that you don't need to do any redundant work or you don't need to repeat the work that you have already done, which may take you months or years to do. So that's my suggestion.
Okay, thank you. David, keen to get your take on a different aspect of collaboration, and one that we've had a question around offshore wind in the doldrums and maybe how I think the implication it may not be suitable everywhere, which I think is a legitimate point. It's not going to be one technology that will solve the problem for all of Asia. It will require a mix of technologies, some countries better suited for renewables in general and specific technologies than others, which leads me to my question, which is around the potential for collaboration between countries in a very physical, tangible sense through grid connections. Are you seeing that? Are you seeing interest in that, say, in Vietnam and elsewhere? And do you see the potential for that throughout Asia?
Absolutely, Mike. It's a really good question, and it's a really interesting part of the broader aspects of renewable energy. And you're right, not every country can produce renewable energy. A good example of that is Singapore, and I think most of the people on the call would probably know about, that Singapore is a very small country. It is restricted by a small amount of land. You can't just put wind turbines and solar panels on it because there's just not enough space. So there's been a big push recently, and we're seeing clients coming to us asking us about grid connections, subsea cables running from neighbouring countries into Singapore. Certainly Vietnam, because we are going to be renewable strong within Southeast Asia. We're one of the candidates there, but also looking over to Indonesia. We've got a number of developers contacting us about that at the moment as well, and that's underway. So developing subsea cables, doing bathymetry work, and determining how many electrons they might need to be able to source Singapore is definitely happening. Between Vietnam and Laos is another one, and also Cambodia and Thailand. So I think in this region up here, particularly if you're landlocked and you are limited by the development of renewable energy, there are opportunities to develop transmission lines and cables across the sea.
Excellent, thank you for that. And I've certainly, from in this part of the world in Australia, we've got one of the largest, most ambitious proponents in that space in Sun Cable, proposing very long cables, some of the longest subsea cables in the world, with some of the largest amounts of generation and storage along the pathway there to deliver up into Asia. They are particularly challenging projects because they do require collaboration between markets and countries. But I think in order to take full advantage of the renewables across Asia, they are very necessary projects as well. I'm cognizant of time. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I did want to bring it back to COP27 just briefly as well, because there was some commentary for the first time written in to the actual the dialogue that came out of COP27 around loss and damage and the potential establishment of a loss and damage fund. And Brown, so I might just throw back to you just for any thoughts that you might have on that. And the reason for that is really, you would think that in a loss and damage fund environment that Asia would be a net beneficiary in that sense. Are you able to shed any light on whether that's definitely going to happen, maybe going to happen, what the model might be, or whether there's still a bit of flesh to go on the bones?
Sure. Yeah. So that was a big conversation at COP as well. And it is an area that I think, that the APAC region, especially Southeast Asia, will benefit from. What they were talking about was needing to cover about $300 billion US per year by 2030. And so the loss and damage finance are closely connected to our ability to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So there's more details that need to be sorted out, but this could be an important way of growing in some of the renewable areas within APAC as this money starts to get distributed to some of the countries that have suffered and do have needs to grow in their economy and transitioning some of their industry.
Great. All right. Well, we'll watch that space with interest. And I think we've hit time on today's session. So I'd like to thank you all for participating in that. If you've got any questions, any needs across the region, please feel free to reach out to any one of us on the panel today or to your local ERM office, where pretty much wherever you are, we'll have people on the ground happy to help you developing your projects and with your broader decarbonisation and ESG needs. Special thank you to my miniature Dash and Nutmeg for her cameo appearance halfway through, but also to Brianne, Laura, Jovi and David, thanks for your time today, and for Sophia and Parachute for putting this together. As I mentioned at the start, we'll ask you to complete a survey if you so wish. Just hold your phone over that QR code, and otherwise we will be in touch with a copy of the ability to direct you to the presentations from today, and can only wish you all the success in your efforts to help have a positive impact on our planet. Thanks very much for your time.